So the focus of today, what Jolly and her awesome team asked me to talk about, was what you wanted to talk about. So you guys filled out a survey. So if you don't like what we're talking about today, you can have a discussion with yourselves about why the topics are here. There was a person somewhere over here who talked about IEP compliance. So I'm being totally compliant with your wishes. You guys identified 3 areas that you wanted to talk about: developing interventions, and services for students, measuring progress in academics and behavior. So we're going to focus on that, but we're going to pull in a bunch of other stuff. I know from traveling around Indiana, your politics are about as active as ours are in Florida. I'll put it that way. And there's memos coming out about MTSS and RTI and IEPs and all of this kind of stuff. I have never been a person who's hooked to labels. Myself and 6 other people, we wrote the first ever publication on RTI. But I was worried about RTI because back in the day I lived through, with Madeline Will when she was Secretary of Education, I lived through REI, if any of you remember that, the Regular Education Initiative. So I have post-traumatic 3-letter words that start with I disorder. And I am not into labels. I'm into behaviors and activities. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and you don't have to talk about MTSS to implement it. MTSS is a group of highly evidence-based behaviors and practices, and you can call them by those practices, like problem solving, like intensifying instruction, like evaluating the impact of instruction. Those are all the components of MTSS. So focusing on those is what you asked today. How do we intensify instruction for students? How do we evaluate whether it's working for academics and behavior? So is that pretty much what you expected for today? Yes. Because the 3 areas that you identified, they were outliers. Everything else was ranked really lower than that. So like I said, I'm trying to be compliant. So we're going to do a little knowledge review about the components of MTSS that are going to relate to today. And I listened carefully, as I said, so I'm really comfortable that you have a good understanding of this, but I wanted to focus it for our work today. So MTSS is basically the integration of academics and behavior to improve instruction for positive outcomes for kids. So for every academic skill, there's an academic behavior. And we're going to talk about that when you do IEPs and you do lesson plans. You can't just focus on the instruction, because the instruction demands that kids engage it, right? But how they engage it is dependent upon the instruction you deliver. So what happens if the instruction you deliver requires engagement skills the kids don't have? Guess what we have? Rowdy kids in a classroom. So a lot of our instructional planning, if not careful, can contribute to kids not being engaged in class because we didn't think about the kids. If we had a lot of time, I do a lot of work with high schools. Rob, is that right? Yeah. And the team over here, this team. I do a lot of work in high schools. And I do a lot of training on MTSS and problem solving in high schools. And I was doing that training about a week and a half ago for a large high school that had concerns about why kids were disengaged. So we do a lot of walkthroughs in high schools with building principals. I was a building principal for 12 years. We do a lot of walkthroughs and we watch instruction and what have you, but what we don't watch is student engagement in the face of that instruction. So we trained principals to do walkthroughs where they evaluated the type of instruction, explicit instruction, guided instruction with teacher support, guided instruction with student support, that type of stuff, and monitored student engagement in the face of that. And what we found out was that the instructional strategies the teachers were using least frequently were the ones that students were most engaged with. Very simple. When the teacher would switch to 3 or 4 other strategies, the kids would go offline. So then we got a focus group of kids together, and we asked them, what kinds of instructional strategies do you find most engaging? They aligned perfectly with the ones that they were engaged with. So the kids said, we prefer guided with teacher support, guided with peer support, not explicit, that this group of teachers were very much into some of the social emotional learning stuff and providing a lot of time for kids to reflect. The kids are going, ditch reflection. If we want to reflect, we'll do it later. Don't have us sit in a class and hold a rain stick and pass it around and go kumbaya. So their engagement was like at 30% during reflection. And the teacher spent 24% of the time in reflection. So this relationship between the instructional strategy and student engagement is critical. It is more critical for kids who are struggling with learning, attention issues, or having particular disabilities. So it is this relationship. It's also about how do we intensify instruction. If you say we need to make the instruction more intensive, hopefully none of you put that in reports. What does it mean? For us it means, and we'll see this, it means more time, narrower focus, and a different type of instruction. So if we say intensifying, Tier 3 is intensive, more intensive, Tier 2 is strategic or supplemental, it's more intensive than Tier. What does that mean? What do we do with the instruction? We add more time. We narrow the focus to the areas that unlock the access skills kids don't have. And we modify the type of instruction as necessary to be able to do that. So we have a formula. We say time, focus, type. And we have to address all three as we intensify instruction in the area of interventions. By the way, the tiers don't exist. It's a model. Tiers are defined by who gets it, not what it is. If everybody gets it, it's Tier 1. If some kids get it, it's Tier 2. If very few kids get it, it's Tier 3. I heard in the back somebody talking about social skills training, doing social skills. Put your hand up. A school psychologist, I think, they're talking about. You're doing social skills training? Yeah. Social skills training in the schools I work with, we do it in the entire school, or we do it with groups of kids, or we do SWAT teams, interocular social skills training. That's social skills training with a 2x4 between the eyes, right? And it can be small group, middle, or it can be the whole school. I have a school that I work with in Miami-Dade called East Little Havana Elementary. 97% free and reduced lunch, 99% bilingual. School is proficient. But there's 180 minutes of reading instruction a day for everyone. Not only their basal series, but everybody gets Wilson's Foundations. But Wilson's Foundations also could be Tier 2. It also could be, see what I'm saying? So if you define it by what you do, it's very confusing. So the tiers are just who gets it. Tier 2 is more intensive than Tier 1. Well, what if your Tier 1 is 70 minutes of reading language arts? And another school is 90. What about a high school that has 50-minute periods versus those that are blocked with 90 to 100-minute periods? Now Tier 2 has to be more than Tier 1, right? So you can't define the tiers until you define Tier 1 in the setting you're working in. It's like the foundation of the house. And Tier 3 is always the most intensive services a school can give. Some schools have more support than others. They can give more intensive services than others. So the idea that this model is the same in every school is ridiculous, because it's based upon those Tier 1 resources and the students we have, etc. So keep that in mind as we kind of move ahead. So here are the critical components of MTSS, and we're going to focus on basically 2 or 3 of them today. Intensifying instruction, multi-tiered, data evaluation, and problem solving. The others are leadership. How many of you have ever worked in a school, not the school you're currently in, of course, or worked for an organization where the leader was a wussy, just weak, and the whole place was adrift? How many of you have had at least one of those experiences in career? If you don't raise your hand, you're being disingenuous. You're not telling the truth. No, this woman's going, yes. I'm going to put my feet up here in a moment, okay? Leadership is really important. And it's very hard for people whose job is to do something else, to keep the ship moving in the right direction, whether that's an organization or a school, if the leadership is poor. That's no different than anything else. Multiple tiers, we're going to talk about problem solving, data evaluation. Communication and collaboration is huge. You guys are doing IEP stuff. There's going to be shifts. There needs to be shifts in how we do IEPs. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And communication and collaboration is important. We never ever want to outrun our coverage. We never want to move farther ahead than where everybody is moving with us. We may have to go slow to go fast. I'd rather take 3 years to do something well than to try to shove it down people's throat in 18 months and nobody does anything with it. Capacity building. Many of you in here are consultant type people. School psychologists, special ed, resource people, even SLD teachers are really consultants to general education teachers. So our goal as consultants is always to increase the capacity of someone else. Increase the capacity of the general ed teacher to be successful. Increase the capacity of the family to be able to work more effectively with their kids. We can't have something that is dependent upon us. When we leave, we have to leave footprints behind that other people now have increased capacity to do the work, unless you are a direct service person. So I want to talk about a couple of things here. I'm going to skip this. It really is just showing the integration of a multi-tiered system and problem solving. We're going to do a deep dive into that. This is a behavior multi-tiered system to kind of go along with the academic one. We're going to talk about that as we go through the individual tiers. So the bottom line for effective schooling is we have to have early warning and identification. I know that the person sitting back there next to Rob at that table, the young woman, you're a preschool person, right? So we have tons of data that kids coming out of preschool and they enter kindergarten. If we have some early, in Florida we call it the Flickers, the Florida Kindergarten Readiness Survey, we can tell you by October and predict with 90% accuracy which kindergarten kids are going to be at or above first grade standards in October. And that's critical, because if we find that out in April, it's too late to do something about. Early warning systems in high school. We know the impact of suspension reduces the probability of on-time graduation by about 18%. We know that kids that get Fs are more at risk than kids with attendance problems, because Fs put kids into credit recovery and they may never recover from credit recovery. And particularly in high schools that don't award credit for interventions. So you lose a half a credit, you're trying to make up a half a credit in algebra, you got to take interventions, you don't get credit for that. You pass the half credit for algebra, but you lost the half elective credit and you're cost neutral. Those kinds of crazy policies. So we want to have early warning systems so that we know ahead of time. So which of our data are early warning? We'll talk about that. We never want to wait. This idea of, well, he'll grow out of it, she'll grow out of it, that is garbage. Because if you do that and you're wrong, we have a problem. If you act and the kid would have grown out of it, the kid's okay. So the idea in kindergarten that we wait past October is silliness. We need to have a stake in the sand that 97% of kids leaving kindergarten meet or exceed beginning first grade literacy standards. And if every kindergarten teacher doesn't know what the beginning first grade literacy standards are, then they need to find out. We're not teaching just to be in kindergarten, we're teaching with a goal of beginning first grade literacy standards. So we always have to know the beginning standards a year ahead of us, or we get mired in where we are right now. That's really important. Monitoring progress. We want to monitor progress, but we want to monitor it in a way that is relevant. If we're going to monitor progress, so for example, we're doing some kind of progress monitoring, we're doing benchmarking. We better be sure that those benchmark assessments predict end-of-year performance with a high accuracy level. In my state, we have the Florida Assessments for Instruction and Reading, and we have a PRS score. It's called Probability of Reading Success at the end of the year. It predicts it with 95% accuracy in October. And if that kid scores 59, let me tell you, that teacher doesn't look at that kid the same way again, because that's a 59 kid, and the kid needs to be at 90. So we would now have 6 months to fix a problem. We don't have to wait till the end of the year. Modifying as necessary. Again, do not wait. If something is not working, don't beat the dead horse. We're going to talk about that this afternoon. What are the criteria for positive, questionable, and poor response? And what do you do from an intervention strategy for each of those levels of response? If you don't think, there's only one condition under which you keep trying, and we'll talk about that. Otherwise, you cut your losses, go back to problem solving, and say, this did not work. We're going to talk about academic engaged time in a moment. And then honesty and transparency. Kids not progressing is no one person's fault. Kids come in with all sorts of baggage. What we don't want to do is to work in silos. Kids who are really struggling need this entire table working together with the same vision from different perspectives, all hands on deck. We can't have people have a meeting and then go back to their silos and do individual stuff. So those are some guiding things we're going to talk about throughout the day. We already talked about how do we intensify instruction, time, focus, and type, but I'm going to give you one other thing. I work well with analogies and metaphors, so you're going to get a ton of them today. So the Dr. Seuss approach to intervention. Time, what, who, and where. I don't have a slide because I want you to write that down if you're interested in it. What do we do when we develop interventions? First, how much time do we have? Why would you develop an intervention that requires 45 minutes a day if you only have RTI time? That's 20 minutes. That's silly. Time. What? What are we going to do? Why would we pick the who until we defined the what? What if the who doesn't know how to do the what? Are you starting to get the Dr. Seuss thing? And then finally, where? So in special ed, we often find a kid eligible for SLD. That defines the where. SLD program. The where defines the who. What if the what that the kid needs is not the what that the who knows how to deliver? Or what if the what is what the who knows how to deliver, but the who doesn't have the time to deliver the what? So if you start with the where, you're stuck with the who, and then you're stuck with the who delivering the what the who knows how to do in the amount of time the who has. That's not individualized education. That's individualizing kids' education based upon available resources and teacher knowledge. And what if the match isn't there? So how often do we write IEPs and ask the designated who if they know how to do the what and if they have the amount of time to do what the what is, what the who has? So I worked with the school district about 2 years ago, early childhood. It was DD, developmental disability plans. And so we took 2 classrooms, we took all the IEPs, and we wrote down all of the time that was in the IEPs for the individual students and added it up. And it was like 3 weeks worth of time for each week that they had designated. There was no way anybody could implement the IEPs because every IEP was developed individually and they never figured out the aggregated time that the who now didn't have to do the what. So the parents were all happy with the IEPs and the kids got half of the services. So we have to think about those types of things as we develop instruction. So let's talk about a couple of things very quickly. Academic engaged time. That is the number of minutes a day that a kid gets quality instruction. Doesn't matter whether it's academics, behavior, tennis, football, piano, driving a car. The more you practice, the better you get. You need more of that if you're struggling. If you are behind, the only way to catch up is if you have more time than everyone else designated for that subject or skill area. We just had the Kentucky Derby on Sunday, right? Sunday or Saturday? Saturday. And if a horse comes out of the, whatever you call the thing they come out of, behind, or a track person comes out of the blocks behind, and you're seeing the rear end of everybody in front of you, how is the only way that you can catch up to somebody if you're behind? Run faster than who? Everybody in front of you. So the minute a kid is behind, they have to outperform everyone else to catch up. So I want you to do something for me. If you have a pencil, write down the number 4 on a piece of paper. Kid's in 4th grade. Kid is working at, write down number 2. the second grade level. How many years behind is the kid? 2. Kid's been in school 4 years. What average progress is a kid making every year who's at the second grade level in 4 years? Half, right? Half a year for a year's time. Would you agree that if you doubled a kid's rate of progress, that would be a strong intervention? Double 0.5, what do you come out with? 1. So now the kid's doing 1 year in a year's time. Write down 6. So now the kid's in 6th grade. When the kid was in 4th grade, they were at the second grade level. Now they're moving a year for a year's time. What level is the kid going to be at when the kid gets to 6th grade with this new rate of progress? 4. Exactly. How far behind is the kid in 6th grade compared to 4th grade? 2 years, the same. It's a different proportion, 33% versus 50. Doug and Lynn Fuchs have taught us that if we want to have highly effective interventions delivered with fidelity and sufficiency in a public school, that we can count on an average of accelerating kids by about a half a year in a year's time. Half a year to 3/4 of a year, but for math, let's do a half a year. It's easier as a group. So if we want to close the gap in 2 years, which is a 2-year gap, or how many years is it going to take us to close a 2-year gap at a half a year per year? 4 years. And to do that, the kids have to grow a half a year in addition to the year, right? Are you with me? So write down 1.5. So as you're having a conference with a parent, and you'll say, we really feel that your daughter, your son, would benefit from this SLD program. They're going to get more time, smaller group. And for them to catch up by 8th grade, if everything goes well, all that's going to have to happen is we're going to have to find instruction that will enable your child to grow at 50% faster than all the kids who have no disabilities. So that's why once a kid is more than 2 years behind, on average, somewhere between 8 and 12% of the kids ever catch up. So when we develop interventions, we have to think about the rate at which those interventions will close a gap. And it's always more than a year in a year's time. So as a building principal, every building principal should have on her or his radar every kid who is behind by a year and a half. And that's urgent. Any kid that's behind 2 years is in crisis. And we wouldn't do a multi-tiered thing. We would go from tier 1 to tier 3 and give that kid everything we have. The problem is if you have 20 and 30% of your school like that, where are you going to get the resources? So we do the peanut butter theory. We have a huge loaf of bread, a limited amount of peanut butter, and our goal to be compliant is to have everybody have something. So we spread the peanut butter so thin that when you take a bite of the bread, you don't even taste the peanut butter. And that's what happens to kids who are way far behind and get 45 minutes a day of SLD help. The national average is 42. A school district I was in yesterday was 50. There's still 280 minutes in the general ed classroom. How is somebody going to fix a kid in 50 minutes to survive 280 when they're more than 2 years behind? Or the case we're going to talk about of a 10th grade kid reading at the 3rd grade level. So interventions is serious stuff. And they can't just be delivered shot from the hip. They have to be powerful. They have to be implemented quickly. They have to be evaluated frequently. And if they're not working to close the gap, we have to do something about it yesterday. So that we have to think about that in terms of how frequently we review our interventions. So in the last school that I was in permanently, we had 330 minutes in the day. You may have 360. Let's use this model. There's 330 minutes in the day, 1,650 minutes in a week, 57,600 minutes in a year, of which 15,600 typically is English language arts. That is the amount of money in your bank account. there are no more dollars. There are no more minutes. You squander them messing around with 11 transitions in an elementary classroom a day, and each transition takes 5 to 7 minutes, and now we've lost 90 minutes of instruction on transitions because we have 11 of them. You can't get those minutes back. Office discipline referral, kid is riding the boards in the principal's office and is down there for 20 or 30 minutes because the principal's off doing something else. You just lost instructional time. So here's a fact. The best predictor of rate of improvement in academic performance for kids is academic engaged time. It predicts it better than IQ, socioeconomic status, anything else. Academic engaged time predicts it better. If you don't have the time, you can't make up for it with some magical intervention. Kids take time to learn. So that's why a multi-tiered system is got some parameters to it. If you have a kid that needs supplemental instruction, the standard parameter is 50% more time for supplemental than is allocated to that subject area in Tier 1. So if it's 90 minutes of reading language arts, it's 45 minutes for Tier 2. And then another 45 minutes for Tier 3. That's why in East Little Havana we have 180 minutes. Something we're going to talk about later. I've given you an academic support plan that kind of lays all of this out, organizes instruction by time, by function, by that type of stuff. So if any of your schools have RTI time, and by the way, RTI is not an adjective, and it's not a verb. We don't RTI somebody. And we don't have RTI time. And he's not an RTI kid. RTI is simply a concept that we use data to evaluate student progress, and it is a general education initiative, even though you got kind of bounced back and forth on that. I understand that, but it should be. We want general ed teachers thinking in terms of, I've spent this much time, I've got that much growth. Wow, this kid's in trouble. Or wow, that kid's doing really well. It's this relationship between time and growth. So because I travel a bit, I have my iPhone like you do, and I was in Detroit yesterday. And so I'm going to the Detroit airport and I run into a massive mess. Cars is just awful. And I was already cutting it close. And I'm looking at my trusty little MapQuest, and I was perfect timing leaving where I was going to be. I had 50 minutes to get to the airport. Golden. It's going to work. Now I'm watching the phone on the top right. It's now up to 1 hour and 7 minutes. And I'm looking and I'm going, I don't got 1 hour and 7 minutes. Somehow or other, so what happened, I drove at like 95 miles an hour when I got out of the, and I don't think they have any police in Detroit, so it wasn't an issue. But at some point, long before my flight ever left, I knew I was toast. But I still had some time to make it up. So when I got free of the traffic jam, I started going faster. And then I watched the minutes coming down on the iPhone. And I knew that because I was going faster, I was going to hit the target. We have to think about that every month with our kids. Because if in October they look good and in November they look bad, we got to do something different in December to get them back on track, or they're not going to make it at the end of the year. That's the concept. And it's not just with general education or special ed. So I want you to look at these 3 lines. These are recent data. They're discovery math, so these are assessments embedded in the curriculum. And this is a kid. The kid is Mackenzie. She's here. And this is the class, and the green line is the grade, because there are multiple, this is 3rd grade, I think, multiple 3rd grades in this school. The red is the class that Mackenzie's in. So with rate of growth, remember, the reason we use graphs and not numbers is because the slope of the line, right? The steeper it is, the more effective the instruction. The flatter it is, the least effective the instruction. So we can just look at that, and I want you to look at that individually, just the first 2 data points. I just want you to look at data point 1 and data point 2 for the 3 lines. Individually decide, is the blue, the red, or the green the steepest, and then share with your shoulder partner. Just look at it, and it should take you 15 seconds to do this. Which one is the steepest line? Blue, red, or green? Which is it? Blue. Absolutely. Who's farthest behind? Blue. Who is responding most effectively to instruction? Blue. So here's the dilemma. And it's totally understandable. General ed teachers are concerned about Mackenzie because she's so far behind. But you know from a response to instruction model that this instruction is highly effective. If you extrapolated that line, that kid would reach the standard by the end of the year. You're always behind till you get there. So if somebody says, yeah, but she's still behind, you're always behind until you catch up. So that's not a conversation we want to have. We want to say, how effective is the instruction? And the new Dear Colleague memo from November is saying that we have to extrapolate to when that student is going to hit the standard. And if we did it, she'd come pretty close by the end of the year. But what happened in the next two data points? What happened to Mackenzie? Right? Now, if you were only collecting data on Mackenzie, what would you conclude? That the instruction is no longer as effective as it was, right? But look at the other two lines. What's happening? Is this Mackenzie's problem or something else? The whole class has fallen down. So if we don't collect progress monitoring data on the peers as well, we make errors in our judgment around variability in our individual students' behavior. So we can never just collect data on interventions for the kid. But look at Mackenzie. She's in the red class, right? Is her slope of the line for the last two data points the same as her class or actually a little above? A little above. She's like, I'm in a class that sucks, but I don't suck as much as them. And her growth rate is actually closer to the grade level. So we wouldn't run in to modify instruction for Mackenzie. We're like, what's going on in this class, right? So we also took behavioral data on Mackenzie. Let's take a look at that. These are her behavioral data for, I think it's time on task. I can't read. Yeah, it's time on task. If you had the first two data points for Mackenzie and her peers, who's growing faster, the peers or Mackenzie? Mackenzie. But now let's say you didn't have the top graph. You only had the bottom one. And Mackenzie fell off. And if you're a behavior specialist and you're looking at that, you're like, whoa, what's happened here? And you think maybe they didn't implement the intervention, maybe who knows what. But now that you have the peer data, what happened? The whole class dropped off. So now where does the intervention need to be, with Mackenzie or the whole class? The whole class. But if you don't have those other data, you make the mistake of trying to fix Mackenzie for something that isn't Mackenzie's issue. And it would be trying to do intervention with the wrong person for the wrong reason. So two takeaways from this. One, we want to evaluate interventions on the slope of the line. And number two, we always need the contextual comparison to do that. So I'm going to speak to school psychologists in here because I didn't hear any social workers. Or maybe special ed teachers as well. How many of you are school psychologists? And some of you know that's my home profession. That's where I started my career. I'm a past president of the National Association of School Psychologists. All that stuff. And my day job is that I'm training director, as Pete said, I'm training director for the PhD program in school psychology at the University of South Florida. So when I say things that may sound critical of school psychologists, I am one of you. I resemble that. So if you take it personally, either find medication, therapy, or drink, whatever your poison is. So school psychologists or whoever else does observation, we have to start modifying our methods of observation. And so there are a number of ways we happen to use. So I teach something called the Madsen and Madsen model, and that's where we can look at the relationship between a kid's on task, peers on task, teacher interaction with the kid, peer interaction with the kid. All of that is done simultaneously. So you can come up with those graphs. So functionally what that looks like, to answer your question, is let's suppose that Susan is the target student, I'm the school psychologist, and these are her posse here, okay? We always take peer data with the same gender. We never violate gender. We can violate everything else, but for all the reasons we don't have time to talk about, it just doesn't work. So I'm watching Susan during a 10-second observation. And she's fairly on task now. She may be writing, however, this dude is crazier than anybody I've ever met before. Okay? I have no idea what she's writing, and that's a point. So she's on task. So I take 10 seconds, observe her. I then go 10 seconds to Cheryl. Back to Susan. 10 seconds to Debbie? Deborah. I only got the DEB, so my closure technique wasn't very good. And then back to Susan. And then, I'm not going to quit trying to do, Aaron. Do you get the point? So every other observation, now I've got her data and I have peer data. So that's one way to get peer data assignment. You never go in and take observation of just one kid. You're wasting so much time and data by doing that. And so if, in this model, if the teacher, who let's say it's Cheryl, during that 10-second interval, doesn't interact with Susan, we put a mark of no interaction. When she does interact, we do the kind of interaction: positive reinforcement, neutral comment, some kind of redirective. And we do that for the peers too. So at the end of it, we find out not only how her behavior compares with peers, we find out the quality of teacher interaction with Susan, because let's say the teacher's really nice to these four and is giving her 5 negatives to 1 positive. So overall, the teachers are very positive, blah, blah, blah. But with Susan, she or he is not. So that classroom climate for her is totally different than it is. Same teacher, different personal experience. So she's acting out, these are not, and you look at the teachers overall, the teacher looks wonderful, except pay attention. See what I'm saying? You can do all of that in the same amount of time you currently do a behavioral observation. It's just what data you collect during that process. So the point here is slope and comparison. So a tabletop. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to do this. Being able to evaluate interventions is very important. Do you use rate of growth to determine if interventions are working? If not, what do you currently use to determine if interventions are working? I'm going to give you about 3 minutes. Please stay on task. Talk about only this. Go. So I want you to make a note about whether or not these 2 areas of academic engaged time, slope, growth of the line, multiple observations is something you want to have further discussions on back at the ranch. Okay? Because at the end of the day, I'm going to ask you to prioritize what you're taking away to have discussions about. I was asked a question about the observation form. I will send that observation form to Jolly, and then she can disseminate it to everyone who is here. But I wanted to add something that Brooke said, because I kind of made a comment with Susan here when Susan was writing something down. Here's the other thing about observation. And I know that some people, I think at this table you were talking about integrating the behavioral stuff with the academic stuff. Then we need to do that in an observation. So I'm watching Susan collecting the data I just talked about. But I have no idea whether her on-taskness resulted in appropriate productivity. So productivity is work completion combined with the accuracy level of the work. So I will never do an observation that involves some kind of academic task without examining the product that the student produced during the evaluation. Because otherwise, I know kids are on task 100% of the time and have no proficiency in anything. I also know kids that are on task 30% of the time and are proficient in everything. We can never assume one without the other. So all observations must have productivity measures to equate the behavior with the academics, right? And that's true in high school, whatever the task is. If it doesn't have some permanent product, then you can evaluate a kid's participation. And if you have a 5th grader with ADHD or attentional issues, and you're talking about rivers in South America, and the ADHD kid raises his hand, and the teacher says, yeah, Rob, I'm really glad to see you're participating and are with the group. And Rob goes, when is the field trip next week? That would be lights on, Motel 6, nobody's home. That kind of describes it. So can get qualitative data as well. Kid raised his hand, participated, and said something that was appropriate to the instructional moment. So we have to be in the moment as observers. We have to be collecting all of these data in this model of integrating academics and behavior. So if you'll open your packets, please. So on the top you have the PowerPoint that you're already using. Your second document is called What is Special About Special Education? And that is our state document that differentiates Tier 1, 2, 3 in specially designed instruction. It's a resource for you, and we will not go through it, but we'll be talking about the stuff that's in it if it's helpful to you. The next thing is this chart, which is a triangle with academic and behavior. If we have time, I'm going to ask you to do a tabletop that identifies what is Tier 1 in reading and math, Tier 2, Tier 3, and what do you have going on for behavior in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. In your PowerPoint, you have an example of a Tier 1, 2, and 3 for behavior. But if you were asked to say, what is our core curriculum in reading and literacy for my school, my grade level, whatever? What is available to kids if they struggle with that? And what is intensive instruction if supplemental isn't enough? And I will tell you that 95% of schools do not have anything that approximates intensive instruction. And we'll talk about that when we get there. The next thing is academic behavior checklist. These are academic behaviors. These are behaviors that students need to engage instruction. And as you look at engagement behaviors, this could be a checklist. So for example, one of the most important academic engagement behaviors for students to have is asking a question. So when you ask me a question, when Melissa asked me a question, when Susan asked a question, I was listening to the question, but I'm also listening to what does it reflect about what they are needing more information around. If nobody asks questions, I have no clue about where you are in this process. It is one of the least frequently used engagement behaviors. And it is the most frequently needed behavior for kids who are struggling. Because if they don't ask questions, then the teacher doesn't know that they don't understand something and can't differentiate on the fly. And there are curricula that teach these academic behaviors. How many, I'm sure you're all close to all familiar with skill streaming. Skill streaming, social skills training. It's Research Press right in Urbana, Illinois, which is a spitting distance from here. Just get on the interstate and go west, and in what, hour and a half, you'll be in Champaign. So you could drop in to Research Press. They have something called classroom survival skills in their curricula that are early childhood, elementary, and then secondary. The classroom survival skills are academic behaviors. They are different from interpersonal behaviors. Very different. These are the skills that kids need. So when we do lesson planning, all of our teachers have this. And when they talk about a standard and what they're going to do to instruct, we ask them, what engagement behaviors do students have to engage that lesson? And they will tell us. And then the teachers dealing with kids who are struggling, if they're at that meeting, they'll go, whoa, I've got 2 kids who can't do that. So now what do? Modify the instruction or ensure that we teach the kids those particular behaviors? So there are specific, explicit instructional strategies for every one of these behaviors to teach kids those behaviors. Setting a goal, self-monitoring, self-instruction. Asking a question, listening, following directions. So we teach our kindergartners following directions and listening. Listening is look at the teacher, listen, and say it to yourself. And we have a standard training. Do this with you. Say this out loud, all of you. I like ice cream. It's one word or 2, depending, but we make it 4. Say it again.
I like ice cream.
Now say it again and put your fingers up when you say each word. Now say it softly. I can hear you, but not loud. Now say it with your inside voice, but point your fingers up when you're saying each word. No, keep your mouth inside. Inside your head voice. Exactly. So we teach from out here to in here. And then we add following directions. Look, listen, say, do. So rather than give something and then go, Susan, did you hear the directions, sweetheart? I don't think so, because don't even have the right paper out. Okay? And you've got 6 kids. So we're like, I'm getting ready to give a direction. Who knows the steps for following directions? Look, listen, say, do. Let's say it all together. Who's ready for me to give the direction? Put your hand up. Now you've got that's all that has to be done, is to integrate this stuff into a lesson where the teacher is pre-teaching engagement behaviors that are part of the process. That's an integrated example, and these are the behaviors that go along with it. The next one is the list of the 10 most effective instructional behaviors for core instruction. The next couple of products we're going to use after lunch. One is called ISIL. It's how we problem solve to figure out why kids can't or are struggling. So I stands for instruction. What is it about the instruction that is a problem for the kid? Curriculum. What is it about the curriculum? It could be the pacing. It could be the background knowledge. It could be a relevancy. It could be vocabulary. What is it about the environment? That is school, classroom, community, home. What is it about the environment that is an issue? What is it about the learner? And that's inside a kid. It's hardwired. So it's beliefs, it's memory, it's skills, it's attention span. It's those things that if the interventions are focused, they're focusing on changing the kid. Now, how many of you would agree that most of your interventions are on the ICE, ICE, compared to how many of them are focused on fixing the kid? Put your hands up if they're mainly ICE interventions. Of course they are. Yet our assessments are all focused on the kid. We have tons of kid data, IQ, achievement, processing, all of this kind of stuff, yet we write interventions in the ICE. But we look at how much data we have on the ICE side of it. We don't. So our assessments are not aligned with the interventions we're writing. We have to expand our data collection, and the observation thing is one of it. And I'm going to be harsh here, if every school psychologist in here does not know the scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction in the class or subject area that is the focus for kids they're working with, you need to know that. You absolutely need to know that. Our school psychology people in training, now they take an entire year, 2 courses on instructional design, on the national reading and math standards, on the relationship between standards and high-stakes assessment, the relationship between progress monitoring, standards, and high-stakes assessment. They understand scope and sequence. They understand pacing. Because everything is in the context of Tier 1. Everything. The only purpose for Tier 2, 3, and Special Ed is to increase success in Tier 1. Tier 1 is the reality show of education. If they don't make it in Tier 1, they're not going to make it after they graduate or leave the public school system. They will never again have these supports. They don't exist anywhere else. They only exist in public schools. And I include charters in that and what have you. So we have to know the context for what's happening. And if you're still using standardized achievement tests, the relationship between standardized achievement tests and standards that the curriculum is about 40%. So we have to be sure that what we measured and the kid didn't do well on is actually reflected in expectations for the standard. It's much easier to do curriculum embedded assessments because you don't have to worry about that. So it's really important for everyone to understand that. And then the last, I don't know why I keep coming to your table. Then the last document, which we'll talk about this afternoon, is an academic support plan that kind of integrates everything we've talked about at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, and we're going to go over that at the end of the day.